Let's talk about a big new Imperial Guard update today, with Games Workshop making a bunch more of their rules work with the new codex. Hello and welcome back to Warspecs Tactics, where today we're talking Astra Militarum once more, and today we're going to be talking about a big FAQ that Games Workshop has dropped for them. There is actually some fairly exciting stuff here, potentially the option for a cheaper commandant datasheet that still does orders and rerolls fine, and what looks to be some of the more efficient big guns for artillery in the codex, and a couple of interesting options for tanks. So as plenty of us know, the Imperial Guard have been waiting for their codex for really quite a long time now, the vast majority of 9th edition, and then even after the Cadia Stance box came out, it's taken a while for the actual codex to be released individually and kind of become an official part of the game. As a result, there's been a fair amount of digital updates for the Astra Militarum that have been awaited. First up, the clarification around Genestealer Cult Brood Brothers, which they dropped with Arcs of Omen. That's now fixed in their FAQ that they can use the regimental units, barring named characters, named regiments, regimental attaches, and field ordnance guns for some reason, but otherwise the disciples of the Four-Armed Emperor can get their hands on most of the Astra Militarum goodies. We've also been waiting on the Main Guard Codex FAQ. I feel like for the most part the codex seems to be working more or less as intended, but I feel like there's a fair few rules that Games Workshop might be looking to alter, or just give us a bit more clarification as to what they meant. The biggest questions I think for that are a bit more clarification as to what parts of the Aegis defense line actually count as giving you cover. Maybe a bit of clarification around the mobile command vehicle rule plus ordering when you disembark. At the moment I believe that you can order when you're inside the vehicle and then disembark and order again, which does seem a bit weird and unintended. And I do wonder whether or not that Rogal Dawn tank commander tank ace upgrade that allows you to order himself is going to be patched or not, as none of the other tank commanders can do that. It seems that all of those questions are still outstanding though. Games Workshop did weirdly post an updated Guard FAQ today, but when you actually clicked into the Guard FAQ it took you back to the old one, so I kind of wonder whether they've just uploaded the wrong file and that's going to materialise maybe tomorrow or some other time. Today though we do have a rather hefty Guard update in the Imperial Armour FAQ. This is the one that makes their fancy Forge World toys work with the new codex, and it's actually yielded some rather interesting results, potentially very strong choices for an HQ choice, some artillery, and even a battle tank, all of which I think could be pretty interesting picks, even compared with the fairly dangerous datasheets that Guard have right now. Let's go through the update section by section, and first up, one thing that they really did need to fix just to make it work was the Regiment Keyword, as that works quite differently compared with the old codex. It's mainly fairly simple stuff here. They've removed the regiment tag from all units to allow you to select your regiment on the old version, as previously you no longer select which regiment you hail from. Beyond that, basically everything also gains the regimental keyword down at the bottom. That's the one that allows you access to the regimental doctrines, though they haven't given it to everyone, including the Aeronautica Imperialis units. They don't get it, as they're not part of any one regiment, I guess. Probably the most interesting change from this section, though, is the change to Cult of Sacrifice. This one's a bit confusing, as it was basically a regimental doctrine that was printed in the Forge World Imperial Armour Compendium book, though now there's also a version of it in Codex Astra Militarum. It sounds like they decided to keep this Forge World version of the Cult of Sacrifice still game legal, but they've done so in a slightly weird way, basically saying that if you've got a detachment with the Born Soldier's ability, they could swap it out for this instead. Basically, it sounds like it to be the equivalent of one of those all-encompassing regimental doctrines, either the Born Soldiers or I guess the Monster Hunters one. But in general, I just don't think that many people are going to want to take it, as really it's just not very good and wasn't in the last codex. The rule basically allows you to ignore combat attrition modifiers with your infantry units and things, and then if any characters and vehicle units get slain, on a 4+ they get to shoot one weapon on death as if they have one wound remaining. Kind of fun, it's supposed to represent Kriegsmen fighting to the last, I think. Though in reality it's just never going to compete against a flat damage buff across the entire army like Born Soldiers is. Overall, I do find it a bit confusing, particularly as this has the same name as one in Codex Astra Militarum. It sounds like you could opt to choose either of them now, this one as a standalone one, or the Codex Astra Militarum one as one of a pair of two doctrines. Fun and fluffy if you did want to keep playing it, I guess, but in terms of game strength it is pretty bad. Moving on, we've got access to orders, and there's a few really interesting changes here. First up, the regimental tactics rule is given out to the vast majority of non-super heavies and non-flyers. That's the rule that gives you orders, either being able to give them or take them. Then the platoon keyword was given out to combat engineers and death riders. Platoon is the keyword that allows you to gain access to regimental or commissar orders shouted your way. So now you could say have those combat engineers with their carcass shotguns being +1 to hit and an extra AP -1. The Death Riders are also interesting enough, getting extra AP and extra +1 to hit in combat. Certainly won't hurt them, though I do feel like they're going to be overshadowed by Rough Riders. They are kind of different units though, as the Death Riders are massively tougher, but the Rough Riders are massively more fighty in combat. Perhaps the most interesting thing though is that rapiers, heavy mortars, Earthshaker and Medusa carriages, and quad launchers, all of those also gain the platoon keyword despite being vehicle artillery, which potentially makes some of them some of the most efficient choices for artillery fire support in the Astra Militarum. I feel like I'm going to have to do a follow-up video to compare them to field ordnance batteries and the like. Getting take aim is really quite big on them. It counteracts the barrage nerfs and gives them an extra pip of AP. I feel like the Earthshaker carriage is going to be particularly interesting, as that got the upgraded profile like the Basilisk, but didn't go up in points. Otherwise, on the orders front, we've also got a bunch of tanks getting access to tank orders. The Carnodon and Malcador tanks also gain the squadron keyword, and they also gain Smoke and Battle Tank, which give them options for a certain few stratagems. There's a bit more for Malcador tanks, which we'll get onto in a second. For tank orders as well, there's also the squadron keyword for the Colossus Bombards and Thunderers, and the Medusas and the Basilisks with the Armageddon pattern, and both of them got their own datasheets. Out of vehicle squadrons and things, it sounds like the Colossus and the Thunderers are both able to take 1 to 3 of them in the same slot still, even though the vast majority of other Guard Codex units lost it. Kind of interesting that they chose to give that to the Colossus, seeing as basically you can't do that with any other artillery now. Finally, for the models that can actually give orders in the Imperial Armour update, there's the Death Corps Field Marshal and the Death Corps Squadron Leader. He's the cavalry guy on the horse. The Squadron Leader maybe isn't that exciting, he just issues the one order, but the Field Marshal I think potentially is very, very competitive. He gains the Commandant keyword and the ability to issue 2 different regimental orders per turn, and also the Senior Officer rule from the Cadian Castellan datasheet, allowing him an aura of reroll ones to hit. Unless I'm missing anything with this guy, then he basically just seems like a cheap and effective Cadian Castellan at 35 points, 15 points cheaper than the standard one, maybe lacking a bit of war gear, but still basically doing the same things in terms of buffing your army, reroll 1s to hit, and 2 orders. If you did want a Cadian Castellan and wanted to save some points for something else, this guy seems very efficient. Overall, some pretty solid changes here though. The Earthshaker cannon batteries look very interesting at their points cost and having platoon, and the Death Corps Field Marshal looks like it's a potentially great source of orders. No idea whether they're going to be increasing the points of these guys at some stage or another, but at the moment they haven't. Sticking with artillery a bit though, and focusing on the actual gun tractor self-propelled ones, I feel like they might have made a bit of an error here, as they haven't actually given them the artillery keyword, where things like the Wyvern and the Manticore all got it. It means that these guys aren't going to have any synergy with things like Expert Bombardiers or the Master of Ordnance yet, and that is a bit of a negative, seeing as this would have been the update that should have in theory given them that. The artillery carriages, like the Earthshaker and friends, they already had it, so they don't need to update that there. The other interesting thing for the artillery was they just completely reissued the datasheets for the Armageddon, Medusa and Basilisk. I'm a little unsure why they decided to redo them wholesale rather than just give them keywords and things with FAQs. It might just have been because they needed a bunch of things changing. Out of these datasheets, first up we have the Armageddon Pattern Basilisk. This one costs 130 points as per the recent Munitorum Field Manual, and it is kind of interesting that it costs 10 points less than the Basilisk, despite being almost the exact same profile in every way. Compared with its previous datasheet, it gains the Regiment Keyword, the Squadron Keyword for tank orders, and smoke launchers. It lost the ability to take 1 to 3 of them, as the Basilisk did, into the new codex, and it never had the Earthshaker cannon profile written onto it, so there's no need to update that one. It just automatically gets the new profile from the Guard book, the one with D6 plus 3 shots and strength 10. I feel like they have made a couple of small errors on this one though, as they still have that regiment keyword in the factions keyword section, plus they didn't give it artillery like the regular Basilisk has. This thing also still seems to have the same movement characteristic that it did before, still moves 12 inches on its top bracket, which is 2 inches better than the Codex artillery. I guess that's technically a small advantage for it, though it's hardly the biggest deal on a tank that you'd usually expect to be static for a lot of the game. The Codex update also kind of robbed it of its main purpose. I think the main reason it had a different datasheet is because it has that enclosed crew compartment which gave it toughness 7. Now all the Codex vehicles all got toughness 7 anyway, so weirdly enough the thing that it's supposed to be a bit better at is now no different to the standard issue Basilisk. Overall though, if you did want a Basilisk, then running it as this one does seem pretty reasonable. At the moment, rules as written, you get basically the same tank. You do lack the artillery keyword, but you get it for 10 points cheaper. unless you were planning to play around with some big artillery synergies like expert bombardiers or something. In general, that means that you've just got a more efficient gun on the board. The other read on artillery datasheet is the Armageddon pattern Medusa. This is the one that is armed with the Medusa siege cannon, 36 inches, d6 shots at strength 10, AP-3 and damage d6, kind of like the old version of the Demolisher cannon, but as a barrage weapon. This one's largely got the same changes, nothing particularly different about this guy. It still doesn't have the artillery keyword, and the Medusa profile is unchanged from before. In general, in terms of raw damage output, the siege cannon is kind of similar to both the Basilisk and the Manticore. They're pretty well balanced now. At 140 points, I'd rate this thing as pretty usable, but not stand out within the Guard artillery. Next up, we've got some updates to the tanks and the super heavies, and first up, and perhaps the most disappointing thing, is that literally nothing got given the turret weapon keyword, meaning that quite a lot of the battle tanks and things are going to be somewhat behind the regular versions. I feel like it could have been nice to give, say, the Carnodon or some of the Malcadors the turret weapon keyword, otherwise they feel just pretty much flatly behind things like the Russ, and I don't feel like they're so efficient that it was something that they couldn't afford to give them. It does mean that some of the super heavies as well are at a bit of a disadvantage compared with the Codex ones. The Codex ones will be hitting on 3s, where the Forge World ones will be hitting on 4s. For the Titanic units, they lose the Steel Behemoth rule. That's the one that allowed them to fall back and charge and shoot at other things despite being locked up in combat, though they can still fall back and shoot with regular Titanic rules. Beyond that, the Titanic vehicles also get the super heavy and smoke keywords. Smoke means my -1 to hit for 1 command point, which isn't really too bad as a reactive defensive buff on a great big tough model. And finally, they also changed the adamantium tracks to adamantine tracks, as they'd changed the name of that on the Bane blades in the Codex. Overall, though, I don't think it's the best news for the super heavies from Forge World. A fair few of them already had at least fairly underwhelming stats. There was one small upgrade though for the Thunderer tanks and 2 Malcador tanks, basically trading the Demolisher cannon's rules for the Demolisher battle cannon out of the new codex. Basically, this is just a solid damage upgrade. The Demolisher battle cannon gets strength 10, AP-3, and damage d3 plus 3, so that's basically an increase from the d6 damage it had before. It's quite a solid damage increase, but also on top of that, the Demolisher battle cannon actually also gets the turret weapon word baked into it, so these are a few Forge World vehicles that do have the turret weapon keyword now, I guess. Kind of interesting that these guns aren't exactly turret mounted or anything. I think they're all hull mounted, but perhaps particularly for the Thunderer that's kind of interesting. That's basically nothing but a great big Demolisher cannon on treads, and it's only 100 points, basically a cut price Demolisher tank. I feel like that could be interesting enough, and does compete kind of okay with the Rosses. Finally, they also did an updated datasheet to reissue the Malcador one, a long-suffering tank that's been worse than the Lehman Ross for quite a while. This is the Malcador's new datasheet. It's a 210 point heavy support tank, and they have changed a few things but not everything in the reissuing of its datasheet. Probably the biggest change was that they had to change the battle cannon's profile, seeing as it no longer matched the Lehman Ross one from the Codex, and they've kind of chosen to do it in a really weird way. They've given it a unique profile called the Malcador battle cannon, but given it the exact same stats as the Lehman Ross one but without the turret weapon keyword. Just seems like a really strange decision on that one to me. The tank is solidly worse than the standard Lehman Ross. It does have 18 wounds, but only a 3 plus save, not a 2 plus, and its secondary armaments just really don't keep up with the standard Ross for the cost. They didn't do anything like update it to a 2 plus armor save, though admittedly if they'd done that, they would have had to do that with the other Malcadors, though I feel like that would have been a good step to bring them in line with the Codex options. As it is, the thing does sit very solidly behind the Lehman Rosses, just a lot underpowered compared with them. It did gain a few keyword updates though, including Smoke, Regimental, Squadron and Battle Tank. Finally, there's just a few other odds and ends. The Trojan support vehicle is now changed so its healing ability targets Astra Militarum vehicles rather than regimental ones. Technically, I guess that this is a small buff. It could target things like the Valkyries now, but still, overall, it's still healing just 1 wound on guard vehicles, so isn't enormously standout. I guess maybe could be okay as a Chimera stand-in. Have an officer ride around in this and order out of it, and then you can do a little bit of fire support with the heavy bolter and heal a vehicle. But overall, I feel like the turret weapon on the Chimera plus the lasgun arrays are probably going to outweigh that benefit. The Hades breaching drill also had a small update, basically saying that you can only take it with combat engineers now. They just removed any reference to Imperial Guard veterans, seeing as now they're no longer a unit in the Codex, sadly. The Hades is the deathcore style breaching drill that you have a team of combat engineers follow around with. Really quite a cool idea. It drills up in the middle of the battlefield and then the team follows them to put some hurt down on the enemy. I feel like it's a little bit underwhelming in context of the units in the Guard Codex though. I believe there's still that unfixed issue with the breaching drill and the transports having to start with a unit inside them. It is a dedicated transport, and in Arcs of Omen tournament games and things, it says that dedicated transports have to start with a unit inside them, otherwise they are automatically destroyed. Rules as written, this thing can never fulfill that, so in theory it automatically breaks whenever it turns up. In reality though, I think it's kind of obvious to see the intent of that rule. It's clearly not aims to be the case, but I think it would be helpful if Games Workshop patched it. Finally, I did notice that the Carnodon's multi-lasers didn't receive any AP buff either on the main turret laser. That thing gets a twin multi-laser that doesn't exist elsewhere. It didn't get either the additional shot or the AP. So overall, a fairly chunky update for the Astra Militarum Forge World options, and one that's actually yielded a few interesting things in terms of competitive choices for the Guard. I'll hopefully aim to make a follow-up video comparing their different flavours of artillery shortly. And I feel like the Thunderer gets quite close to the Demolisher in terms of efficiency if you really want to demolish a cannon with damage D3 plus 3 in your life. Plus the Deathcore Marshal appears to be basically a Cadian Castellan but cheaper at the moment, unless they patch his points cost. Definitely a few interesting bits, though I would still say that the majority of the Forge World rules remain kind of underwhelming on the whole. In any case, let me know your thoughts on the update down in the comments below, particularly if there's any other implications that I've missed or misunderstood. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k updates coming. I do tend to post new things just about every day, and keep up with Games Workshop's news and releases. Finally, if you have been finding these updates useful, I would just like to mention as well that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and you can find that links down in the video description. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.